Some people say destiny does not knock on your door. It tears the whole house apart until you finally open your eyes. On a warm Saturday morning in Savannah, Georgia, Ava Brooks stood in front of the full-length mirror inside her childhood bedroom, staring at the white wedding dress hanging loosely from her shoulders. It had never been meant for her. Every flower arranged in the church across town, every guest arriving in expensive cars, every ribbon tied around the wooden pews had been prepared for her older sister, Olivia. Ava had spent the last 3 weeks helping decorate the reception hall, folding invitations, and smiling politely whenever relatives talked about how lucky Olivia was to marry into the mysterious Hayes family. No one ever asked what Ava thought. No one ever cared that she had quietly given up a scholarship to help her family survive after her father passed away. Her stepmother, Patricia Brooks, had always said that life was simple. One daughter was born to shine, and the other was born to sacrifice. That morning the front door slammed so hard the windows rattled. Patricia rushed into the bedroom with tears running down her face, clutching a folded letter in her shaking hands. Olivia was gone. She had left before sunrise with another man, leaving behind nothing but a short note saying she could not marry someone everyone in town called a fool. The room fell silent. Ava looked at the letter and then at the wedding dress reflected in the mirror. For a moment, she thought the ceremony would simply be canceled. But Patricia slowly turned toward her with a look that made Ava's heart sink. "You have to go instead," she whispered. Ava laughed at first because the idea sounded impossible. She had never even spoken to the groom. She only knew the stories people told. Nathaniel Hayes was strange. He lived alone in an old estate outside the city with an elderly caretaker. He rarely spoke. He dressed in plain clothes, wandered through local markets feeding stray animals, and sometimes smiled at children as though he did not understand why adults laughed at him. People called him simple-minded. Some said he had inherited family money but never learned how to use it. Others claimed he was not smart enough to run his own life. Patricia grabbed Ava's hands. The Brooks family owed more money than anyone in town realized. Their small business had been failing for years, and the marriage agreement with the Hayes family would erase every debt. If the wedding did not happen, they would lose the house. Ava looked toward the old family photographs sitting on the dresser. Her father had always told her that kindness was not weakness. Sometimes it was the bravest thing a person could give. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Less than 2 hours later, she found herself standing outside a small white church beneath a bright southern sky, wearing a dress chosen for another woman and carrying flowers she had never wanted to hold. The doors opened, and every face turned toward her. At the end of the aisle stood a tall man in a simple gray suit. His dark hair was slightly untidy, and his gentle blue eyes wandered around the room with the quiet curiosity of someone seeing the world for the first time. Then, just before the music began, Nathaniel Hayes looked directly at Ava and offered her the warmest, kindest smile she had ever seen. Ava Brooks could barely remember the vows she repeated inside the little white church because her mind was still trying to understand how her entire life had changed in a single morning. The ceremony ended with polite applause, soft music, and the curious whispers of guests who could not believe that the younger Brooks sister had taken the place of the bride who had disappeared. Nathaniel Hayes stood beside her through it all with the same gentle smile he had worn when the church doors first opened. He did not ask questions. He did not seem confused or embarrassed. When the minister told him he could kiss his bride, he simply took Ava's hand with surprising care and softly said, "Thank you for coming." The guests laughed quietly, convinced that the strange young man truly did not understand weddings at all. Ava lowered her eyes, not because she was ashamed of him, but because she suddenly felt sorry for someone the whole town treated like a joke. After the reception ended, an old black sedan carried them away from the church and toward the Hayes estate on the edge of Savannah. Ava had expected a grand mansion filled with expensive decorations and servants, but instead she found an old southern house surrounded by ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The building looked peaceful rather than wealthy. A gray-haired caretaker named Mr. Walter welcomed them with a warm smile and quietly carried Ava's suitcase inside. Nathaniel followed behind, stopping only to pick up a tiny turtle crossing the stone pathway and gently place it in the grass. Ava watched him from a distance, surprised by the tenderness in such a simple act. Inside the house, everything felt strangely ordinary. The furniture was old but spotless. Family photographs covered the fireplace, though most of the faces were turned away from the camera or hidden in shadow. There were no signs of luxury that matched the stories people told about the Hayes family fortune. Nathaniel walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and proudly held up a homemade apple pie. "Mr. Walter says pie makes sad days better," he said with the innocent excitement of a child. Ava could not help smiling. They sat together at the wooden kitchen table while rain began tapping softly against the windows. Nathaniel carefully cut 2 uneven slices and pushed the larger piece toward her. "You looked scared today," he said quietly. Ava looked up, surprised by the observation. Everyone else had spent the day talking about the missing bride, the family debt, and the unusual marriage. Nathaniel was the only one who seemed to notice how she felt. "I am all right," she answered gently. He nodded as though he accepted her words, but after a moment he stood and disappeared into another room. When he returned, he was carrying an old music box made of polished walnut. He wound the small key on the side, and a soft melody filled the kitchen. "My mother used to play this when I was afraid," he whispered. "Maybe it can help you too." Ava stared at the little music box while the rain continued outside. For the first time that day, the tightness in her chest began to fade. She looked across the table at the man everyone called a fool and realized that not once since meeting him had he spoken an unkind word, asked for anything, or made her feel trapped. As the old melody floated through the quiet house, Ava found herself wondering if the whole town had been wrong about Nathaniel Hayes. A week passed, and life inside the old Hayes estate settled into a quiet rhythm that Ava Brooks had never expected. Every morning, she woke to the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread coming from the kitchen. Mr. Walter always prepared breakfast before sunrise, while Nathaniel Hayes sat on the back porch feeding birds with little pieces of toast. He smiled every time a robin landed near his feet, as though it were the greatest event of the day. The townspeople continued talking. Whenever Ava visited the grocery store or the local bakery, she heard the whispers. Some pitied her for marrying a man they believed could barely take care of himself. Others laughed that the Brooks family had traded one daughter for another just to save their debts. Ava never answered them. She simply carried her bags home and tried to ignore the voices. One afternoon, she stopped at the old hardware store to buy a few things for the house. A group of young men standing outside noticed her wedding ring and immediately began making jokes about Nathaniel. One of them laughed and said that even a broken clock looked smarter than the man she married. Ava lowered her eyes and walked away without saying a word, but something inside her hurt more than she expected. When she arrived home, she found Nathaniel kneeling beside the front garden, carefully replanting a row of white lilies that had been damaged by a storm. His hands were covered in dirt, and there was a small scratch on his wrist from the garden fence. He looked up, noticed the sadness on her face, and stood immediately. "Did someone make you cry?" he asked with quiet concern. Ava quickly smiled and shook her head. "No, I am just tired." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny smooth stone shaped almost perfectly like a heart. "My mother used to collect these," he said. "She told me that when people are hurting, they should hold on to something good until the feeling passes." Ava accepted the little stone and closed her fingers around it. No expensive gift she had ever received carried the same warmth as that simple gesture. Later that evening, heavy rain rolled across Savannah. The old roof above the west side of the house began to leak, and water dripped steadily into the hallway. Before Ava could find a bucket, Nathaniel climbed a ladder and disappeared into the attic. She worried because everyone said he was careless and clumsy, but only a few minutes later the leaking stopped. Nathaniel came back down soaked from the rain with a shy smile on his face. "I think the house feels better now," he said. Ava handed him a towel, and for the first time she laughed. It was a quiet laugh, but it filled the old house with life. That night she could not sleep. She sat near the window listening to the rain while the little music box rested on the table beside her. Across the yard, she noticed a soft light coming from the old barn. Curious, she slipped on her coat and walked outside. Through a small crack in the wooden door, she saw Nathaniel sitting alone at an old desk. The gentle, awkward man everyone called a fool was reading a thick business report covered with numbers and charts. His expression was calm and focused, nothing like the innocent smile he showed the world during the day. Before Ava could understand what she was seeing, Nathaniel quietly closed the folder, blew out the lantern, and the darkness swallowed the secret she was not supposed to find. Ava stood perfectly still outside the old barn, her hand resting lightly against the weathered wooden door. The lantern inside had gone dark, but the image she had seen remained clear in her mind. Nathaniel Hayes had been reading pages filled with numbers, charts, and business reports with the calm confidence of someone who understood every line. It was nothing like the gentle, awkward man who smiled at birds and carried tiny turtles across the garden path. She quietly returned to the house before he could notice her, telling herself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe the papers belonged to Mr. Walter. Maybe Nathaniel was only looking at pictures. Yet as she climbed into bed, she realized she had never once seen confusion in his eyes. People called him foolish because he spoke slowly and lived simply, but there had always been a quiet awareness about him that was difficult to explain. The next morning arrived bright and clear. Nathaniel was already outside fixing an old wooden fence that separated the garden from the pasture. He greeted Ava with the same warm smile and handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked while walking through the fields. "These looked lonely," he said softly. "I thought they might like living inside the house." Ava accepted them and searched his face for some sign of the man she had seen in the barn, but all she found was kindness. Later that afternoon, Mr. Walter asked Ava if she would help deliver a basket of homemade bread to an elderly widow who lived a few miles away. Nathaniel insisted on carrying the basket himself. The little farmhouse sat at the end of a quiet dirt road surrounded by pecan trees. The old woman greeted Nathaniel with tears in her eyes and wrapped her arms around him. "You never forget anyone," she whispered. Nathaniel simply smiled and helped repair her broken porch steps before they left. On the drive home, Ava could not hold back her curiosity any longer. "How do you know so many people?" she asked. Nathaniel looked out the window at the passing fields. "My mother used to say that if someone feels invisible, the kindest thing you can do is remember their name." His answer was simple, but something about it touched her deeply. That evening, Savannah hosted its annual community fundraiser inside the Old Town Hall. Mr. Walter encouraged them to attend because the entire neighborhood would be there. Ava wore a simple blue dress, while Nathaniel arrived in the same plain gray suit from their wedding day. The moment they entered, whispers spread across the room. Some people smiled politely, but others looked at Nathaniel with open amusement. Ava noticed the uncomfortable glances and quietly reached for his hand. To her surprise, he gently squeezed hers, almost as though he wanted to reassure her. Instead, as the evening continued, the mayor stepped onto the stage to thank everyone for supporting the town's scholarship fund. Suddenly, his expression changed. A distinguished older gentleman wearing an expensive black suit had just entered through the main doors surrounded by several assistants. The entire room fell silent. The mayor hurried forward and shook the man's hand with obvious respect. Ava looked around, confused, until she noticed Nathaniel standing completely still beside her. For one brief second, the older gentleman looked directly at him. His posture straightened, and a faint smile crossed his face, almost like someone greeting an old friend. Then, before anyone else seemed to notice, Nathaniel quietly lowered his eyes and stepped back into the crowd, as though he wanted the moment to disappear. Ava watched the exchange in silence, feeling that the mystery surrounding her husband had only just begun. Ava could not forget the way the distinguished stranger had looked at Nathaniel during the fundraiser. It had lasted only a second, but there had been unmistakable respect in the older man's eyes. On the drive home, Nathaniel sat quietly beside her, looking out at the moonlight stretching across the Georgia fields as though nothing unusual had happened. Mr. Walter drove the old sedan with both hands resting gently on the wheel, humming a soft tune that matched the rhythm of the tires against the country road. Ava wanted to ask what she had witnessed, but every time she looked at Nathaniel, he seemed so peaceful that the question stayed inside her heart. The following morning, she walked into town to buy flour and fresh vegetables for dinner. As she stepped into the bakery, she noticed several people gathered around the television hanging above the counter. The local news was covering a large charity event in Atlanta where one of the biggest family-owned companies in the South had announced a new scholarship program. The camera briefly showed a group of executives standing together on a stage. Ava froze. The distinguished older gentleman from the fundraiser was there, surrounded by reporters. Beneath the screen, the news anchor introduced him as Charles Whitfield, chairman of the Whitfield Financial Group, one of the most influential business organizations in the country. Ava quietly paid for her groceries and walked outside, but the image stayed with her. Why would someone like that recognize Nathaniel? When she returned to the estate, she found Mr. Walter trimming roses near the front porch. Gathering her courage, she asked if Mr. Whitfield had ever visited the house before. The old caretaker paused for a moment, then smiled kindly. Some friendships are older than they appear, he answered before returning to his work. It was not really an answer, but somehow it felt important. That afternoon, Nathaniel suggested they take a walk through the woods behind the estate. The path led to a quiet lake where wildflowers covered the shoreline and ducks drifted peacefully across the water. Nathaniel sat on the old wooden dock and skipped small stones across the surface. Ava joined him, holding the little heart-shaped stone he had given her days before. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. Nathaniel nodded. "At the fundraiser, that man looked at you like he knew you." Nathaniel watched another stone disappear into the water. Maybe he remembered someone else. Ava studied his face. "And the papers in the barn?" For the first time since they had met, Nathaniel did not answer immediately. A gentle breeze moved through the trees while the water reflected the afternoon sun. Finally, he looked at her with quiet honesty. Sometimes people hide parts of themselves because the world only loves what it can use. Ava did not fully understand his words, but she could hear the sadness behind them. Before she could ask another question, the sound of approaching engines echoed through the trees. 3 black luxury cars slowly entered the long driveway leading toward the estate. Men in dark suits stepped out and opened the rear door of the first vehicle. Charles Whitfield emerged, straightened his jacket, and looked directly toward the lake. The moment Nathaniel saw him, the gentle smile disappeared from his face. He stood up calmly, and for the first time, Ava noticed that the quiet man everyone called a fool carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent his life being obeyed. Nathaniel stood quietly at the edge of the lake while the line of black cars came to a stop beneath the old oak trees. The afternoon breeze moved gently across the water, carrying the scent of wildflowers through the air, but the peaceful moment had disappeared. Ava watched the older gentleman step forward with the confidence of someone who was used to being respected everywhere he went. The men beside him remained perfectly still, waiting for his next move. Mr. Walter, who had followed them from the house, lowered his head slightly the moment he saw the visitor. Ava noticed it immediately. The old caretaker had always treated Nathaniel with kindness, but now he looked almost formal, as though an invisible rule had suddenly returned. Charles Whitfield walked directly toward Nathaniel and stopped only a few feet away. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then the older man smiled with quiet relief. "I have been looking for you," he said. Nathaniel looked down at the ground before answering. "I know." Ava had never heard his voice sound like that before. It was calm, clear, and completely different from the shy young man who spoke softly over apple pie or carried lost animals back into the fields. Charles glanced toward Ava with gentle curiosity. "So this is the young woman." Nathaniel nodded. "Her name is Ava." The older man extended his hand politely. "It is an honor to meet you." Ava accepted the greeting, though confusion filled her heart. She looked from Charles to Nathaniel and back again, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Instead, Charles reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed Nathaniel a thick envelope. "The board has waited long enough," he said quietly. "They will not move forward without you." Nathaniel accepted the envelope but did not open it. "I told them I needed more time." Charles looked toward the lake before speaking again. "Your grandfather built an empire, your father protected it, and now thousands of families depend on the decisions only you can make." Ava felt the world around her grow strangely quiet. Thousands of families. An empire. The words did not belong to the simple life she had come to know inside the old Hayes estate. She looked at Nathaniel, hoping he would deny everything, but he remained silent. Finally, Charles turned to her with a kind expression. "I imagine nobody ever told you who your husband really is." Nathaniel took a slow breath. "I was going to." Charles smiled sadly. "You have been saying that for almost a year." Mr. Walter stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Ava's shoulder. "Miss Ava, the Hayes family is not what people believe." Nathaniel did not inherit a forgotten farmhouse. He inherited one of the largest private investment companies in the country. Ava could barely speak. Her eyes returned to the man standing beside her. The plain gray suit, the quiet smiles, the old music box, the heart-shaped stone, the kindness he had shown every stranger. None of those things had been false, but they had never been the whole truth. Nathaniel slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested a newspaper clipping showing him years earlier, standing beside his late father in front of a towering office building in Atlanta. He was wearing an expensive black suit, and dozens of reporters surrounded him. Ava looked at the photograph, then back at the man she had married. Nathaniel lowered the paper and met her eyes with complete honesty. "I never pretended to care about you," he said softly. "I only pretended to be someone the world would leave alone." Ava stood beside the quiet lake with the newspaper clipping still trembling slightly in her hands. The young man in the photograph looked almost identical to the Nathaniel she had come to know over the past weeks, yet everything around him was different. Tall buildings stretched into the sky behind him. Cameras flashed from every direction, and people in expensive suits looked at him with admiration instead of amusement. She slowly lowered the paper and looked at the man standing before her. The gentle smile that had comforted frightened birds and lonely strangers was still there, but now she could see something else hidden beneath it. It was not arrogance. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had carried a heavy burden for a very long time. Charles Whitfield gave Nathaniel a respectful nod before turning back toward the waiting cars. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning in Atlanta," he said. "Whether you come or not, they will wait for your decision." Nathaniel thanked him softly, and within moments the line of black cars disappeared down the long gravel road, leaving only silence behind. Mr. Walter quietly returned to the house, understanding that some conversations belonged only to two people. Ava and Nathaniel remained standing beside the lake. The afternoon sun reflected across the water while a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves around their feet. Ava finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked. "Why would someone leave all of that behind?" Nathaniel sat down on the old wooden dock and looked out across the water. "Because I spent my whole life wondering if anyone could see me without seeing my family name first." He picked up a small stone and tossed it gently across the lake. "When my father died, people stopped asking if I was happy. They only asked if I was ready to lead the company. Friends became investors. Invitations became business opportunities. Every conversation had a price attached to it." Ava sat beside him, listening carefully. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the little heart-shaped stone he had given her. "My mother used to tell me that the only way to know someone's heart was to remove everything they wanted from you." He smiled sadly. "So I disappeared." Ava thought about the old house, the plain clothes, the apple pie, the tiny turtle on the garden path, and the music box that played whenever she felt afraid. None of those moments had been false. They had simply belonged to the real Nathaniel instead of the one the world expected him to be. "Did you know it would be me?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. "I was supposed to marry your sister because our families had an agreement from years ago. But the morning she left, I was ready to cancel everything. Then the church doors opened, and I saw someone walking toward me who looked scared, not greedy." He smiled softly at the memory. "When you stood beside me, you never asked about my money. You only worried that people were laughing at me." Ava lowered her eyes. She remembered every whispered joke and every cruel comment she had silently endured because she believed he deserved kindness. Nathaniel looked at her with complete honesty. "I did not hide the truth to deceive you. I only wanted one person in my life who would choose the man before the fortune." Tears gathered in Ava's eyes, not because she felt betrayed, but because she realized the lonely young man everyone called a fool had been carrying a secret far heavier than anyone imagined. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, she reached out and gently placed the little heart-shaped stone back into his hand, silently letting him know that the person she had come to care about had never been the name in the newspaper, but the quiet soul sitting beside her on the old wooden dock. A few days after their conversation by the lake, the quiet rhythm of the old Hayes estate returned, but something had changed between Ava and Nathaniel. The silence that once came from uncertainty now felt peaceful, as though two people had finally stopped hiding from each other. Every morning they shared coffee on the back porch while the sun rose above the Georgia fields. Nathaniel still fed the birds, and Ava still laughed when he spoke to them, as though they understood every word. Yet now, when she looked at him, she could see both sides of the man she had married. She saw the gentle soul who carried lost animals across the road, and she saw the heir who had walked away from a powerful empire because he wanted to be loved for who he was. One afternoon, a black envelope arrived at the estate. Mr. Walter placed it carefully on the kitchen table and quietly left the room. Nathaniel opened it and found an invitation from the Whitfield Financial Group. The board had organized a charity gala in Atlanta to celebrate the opening of a nationwide scholarship foundation, and they were asking him to attend as the future chairman of the company. Nathaniel folded the letter and set it aside. "I do not have to go," he said. "They will understand." Ava looked at him for a moment before gently pushing the invitation back toward him. "You spent your whole life carrying other people's expectations," she said softly. "Do not run away now because you are afraid of mine." Nathaniel looked surprised. "You are not angry." Ava smiled. "I was never in love with a fortune. I was in love with the man who gave me wildflowers and homemade pie." A few days later, they arrived at the Grand Ballroom in Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers filled the enormous hall with warm golden light, and hundreds of guests stood talking beneath towering white flower arrangements. The moment Nathaniel and Ava entered, the room became silent. Business leaders, politicians, and community organizers slowly turned toward them. Then, one by one, people began walking forward to greet Nathaniel with quiet respect. Ava stood beside him, watching as men and women whose names appeared on television thanked him for scholarships he had secretly funded, hospitals he had quietly supported, and families he had helped without ever asking for recognition. The gentle stranger from the old farmhouse had never stopped changing lives. He had simply done it without cameras. Across the ballroom, Ava suddenly recognized two familiar faces. Patricia Brooks and Olivia stood near one of the marble columns, staring at Nathaniel with complete disbelief. Olivia had spent months believing she had escaped a foolish husband, only to discover that the man she rejected was one of the most respected young businessmen in the country. Patricia hurried across the room, her expression filled with regret. "Ava," she whispered, "we did not know." Ava looked at the woman who had spent years telling her she existed only to sacrifice for others. Before she could answer, Olivia stepped forward and looked directly at Nathaniel. "If I had stayed that day," she said softly, "none of this would have happened." Nathaniel smiled politely, but his eyes never left Ava. "You are right," he answered. "None of this would have happened." He reached for Ava's hand and gently held it. "Because the person who walked through those church doors was the one I had been waiting for all along." In that moment, beneath the golden lights and the silent gaze of everyone around them, Ava understood that the greatest secret Nathaniel had hidden was never his wealth. It was the simple hope that somewhere in the world there was one person who would choose his heart before his name. Several months passed after the gala in Atlanta, and life at the old Hayes estate settled into a happiness neither Ava nor Nathaniel had ever expected to find. The world now knew who Nathaniel truly was, but very little had changed inside the house surrounded by oak trees. He still woke before sunrise to feed the birds on the back porch. He still carried lost turtles across the garden path and left baskets of bread on the doorsteps of lonely neighbors. Ava often smiled when reporters called asking for interviews, because the man they wanted to photograph was usually outside repairing a fence or planting flowers with Mr. Walter. One quiet autumn afternoon, Nathaniel returned home from a meeting in Atlanta carrying a small wooden box. He found Ava sitting beneath the old oak tree where they often shared coffee together. Without saying a word, he handed her the box. Inside rested the little music box that had comforted her on the first night she entered the estate, beside the smooth heart-shaped stone she had once returned to him by the lake. Beneath them was a folded letter written in Nathaniel's careful handwriting. Ava opened it slowly. The first sentence made her eyes fill with tears. "Thank you for seeing the man everyone else forgot to look for." She looked up at him, unable to speak. Nathaniel sat beside her and smiled softly. "When my father died, I thought I had lost my family. When people only wanted my name, I thought I had lost myself. Then you walked into that church wearing a dress that was never meant for you, and somehow you gave both of them back." Ava reached for his hand and held it gently. "I did not save you," she whispered. "You were always there. I was simply lucky enough to meet the real you." A few weeks later, Mr. Walter quietly decorated the old garden behind the house with white flowers and lanterns. Charles Whitfield arrived from Atlanta, along with friends, neighbors, and many of the families Nathaniel had helped. Over the years, even Patricia Brooks and Olivia came, carrying no expectations and asking for nothing. Time had softened the bitterness they once carried. Patricia approached Ava before the ceremony began and placed a simple silver bracelet into her hand. "Your father bought this when you were a little girl," she said quietly. "I should have given it to you a long time ago." Ava embraced her without anger because she had learned that forgiveness was sometimes the final gift a person gave themselves. As the evening sun settled across the fields, Nathaniel and Ava stood together beneath the old oak tree. Their first marriage had been born from fear, misunderstanding, and sacrifice. This one belonged only to them. There were no family debts to repay and no promises made for someone else's future. Mr. Walter wound the little music box, and the same gentle melody floated through the warm autumn air. Nathaniel looked at Ava with the same kind smile he had worn the day she first walked through the church doors. "If you had known who I was," he asked softly, "would you still have married me?" Ava looked around at the people laughing together, at the old house that had become a home, and at the man who had taught her that kindness was greater than wealth. She smiled and gently placed the heart-shaped stone into his hand once more. "I did not fall in love with the man in the newspaper," she said. "I fell in love with the one who thought lonely flowers deserved a place to belong." As the lanterns began to glow beneath the evening sky, Nathaniel took her hand, and together they walked forward into the life they had chosen for themselves, proving that the greatest fortunes in the world are not measured by money, but by the hearts that recognize each other when everything else is taken away.